Hello and welcome to episode 161 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR, as I will be twice weekly for the next 7 months. I am joined by fellow co-founder Evan Silva. And Evan, we are officially in the offseason. That means best ball. That means dynasty. That means NFL free agency. That means the NFL draft. That means win total betting. That means futures betting. That means DFS preparation and a ton more. It's the offseason, brother. But before we get into the football, we just want to say a few things about Chris Wesseling, who most of you guys probably know we lost a couple weeks ago. So, Evan, how's it going? How you holding up?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. We haven't podcasted since the Super Bowl, you and I. So I just wanted to say something about Chris Wesseling because Chris passed away due to cancer after beating it the first time. And then it returned. And you and I spent 6 years working with Wes at RotoWorld before he moved on to the NFL. And a lot of people remember Chris as a podcaster because of the success of their Around the NFL podcast across the United States and especially in the UK. But to me, I will remember Chris Wesseling as one of the greatest sports writers, as far as I'm concerned, to ever live. Like, he was the embodiment of a sports writer. He was a wordsmith. He was a guy whose knowledge was encyclopedic. He didn't just love football. He loved all sports. I think that grew out of, he has like a big family with a lot of brothers. He went to this pretty famous high school in Cincinnati that produced like Kyle Rudolph. And, he just grew up loving sports. Maybe the two greatest pieces, I think, as a sports writer that he ever wrote were these NFL.com long forms about the Bengals and the old Houston Oilers. His writing was just so multi-dimensional because he could master anything, whether it be, a little RotoWorld blurb or a long form piece covering, specific historical topics, whatever. He was also the first person that I can ever remember proactively advocating for Pro Football Focus. He was the first guy who showed me the PFF website back in the day. He was like, yo, you got to check this out. It was, it was awesome. And he actually had his beefs with PFF over the years. He was a very old soul and, strong opinion guy. But that just goes to show his passion. And I remember the day that Wes told me that he was leaving RotoWorld and going to work for the NFL. And I was so selfish because I was sad and I was mad that he was leaving after Greg Rosenthal had left. But it was the best decision of his life because he went on to meet his wife, Lakeisha, in LA. He became an international star because of their reach across seas. And Greg texted me recently and he said that Chris will be a legend forever because of that. And he's right. And he never would have been that had he stayed at RotoWorld, which I selfishly wanted him to do. And anyways, I got to hang with Chris twice before he passed, once in Los Angeles and once on Tybee Island in Georgia. And he was just a wonderful human being. I met Lakeisha, his wife, a great, great, loving woman. And about 6 or 7 months ago, they had a baby boy, Lincoln. And so if anyone listening to this would be interested in supporting Lakeisha and Lincoln, Chris's family, there's a GoFundMe set up for those two. And I'm going to miss him so much. And a lot of people are going to miss him.
Yeah, really well said. When I first started, it was, I know everybody thinks of RotoWorld now as really big and huge and all encompassing. When I started, it was Evan, it was Wes, and it was Greg. And that was basically it. And I was like, man, this is crazy. And I looked up to Wes so much. And I one reason I did was because I think he understood that football was cool and everything, but it was just a small part of life. Like, he had so many other interests beyond football and especially fantasy football. He was never as into fantasy as Evan and I were. He was more into football, the game. And I think it's more multifaceted, not as sick as Evan and I are obsessing about players and player values. But man, when it came to player values, everybody respected so much what Chris had to say. And I remember one time I was talking to him about Odell Beckham, and I was like, man, and I went through all the data about how much of an outlier Odell Beckham is and how it's really hard to pick out outliers. And every time people try to do it, that they end up being wrong. And Chris just wrote back, he said, yeah, but I can see it. He's an outlier. And I was like, okay. And then he went on to be just that as a rookie, obviously, and for much of his career before the injuries came for Odell. So yeah, man, it's just a really bad gut punch, I think, because he was beating it, and just for it to come back right after he had his baby is really, really tough. So yeah, the GoFundMe, we'll go ahead and retweet it from ETR's Twitter as soon as this podcast is over, so you guys can find it. Better if you can spare anything to donate to Lakeisha and Lincoln. All right. On the next two shows, we're going to be looking back at the 2020 fantasy football season, what we got right, what we got wrong. And to me, it's not that important exactly what we got right and what we got wrong. It's most important, I think, to try to understand what happened and why, so we can learn from it going forward, improve our process, the way we think about player values. Before we get to the show, I want to go over a few things related to the 2021 Established Run Draft Kit. Yes, we have already soft launched the 2021 draft kit. We have our best ball rankings up for Underdog and FFPC. Those are obviously continuously updating. Eventually, the draft kit will be everything we think you need to be ready for your draft. Content and rankings for every format, best ball, dynasty, any kind of weird league you have, 6-point, tight end premium, whatever it is. Note that if you bought our draft kit last year, you have access now for free until May. No extra cost or obligation. Just log in. You'll be able to access everything. If you are new, it's the same price as last year, $34.99. I know a lot of people probably don't have their head in the drafting game yet, but hopefully you listened to the pod that we did last week with Justin Herzig and understand the opportunity in best ball for serious fantasy players. And I know if you guys are listening to this, you're serious fantasy players. So we'll talk about all that over the next few months. All right. We're going to do early rounds on this podcast. Next podcast, we'll do some later round stuff. And I want to start in the first round, where I thought the first round was really decimated by injury, right? That was a story. Christian McCaffrey got hurt. Saquon Barkley got hurt. Ezekiel Elliott got fat. But if you prioritized Kamara, Devontae Adams, Derrick Henry, I think you did pretty well there in the first round. And I want to stick on Derrick Henry here because we were slightly above market on him, but that made a pretty big difference. And it's honestly against my nature to be above market, to be all in on a player with the archetype of Derrick Henry, very reliant on volume, very reliant on touchdowns. But as we talked about leading up to this season, and I honestly took Derrick Henry above Alvin Kamara when the back injury stuff that turned out to be overblown on Alvin Kamara. But when that stuff came up, I was taking Henry above Kamara, and I felt good about it. No team kind of centers their entire offense around Derrick Henry, is who I just mentioned outliers with Wes and Odell. I mean, obviously such a massive outlier, not just in talent, but in the way that he's used. So Derrick Henry had an absolute massive standout year. So I felt good about being willing to say, hey, this is not the kind of guy I normally would take at 4th or 5th overall, but I'm willing to do it in this specific case. Evan, what did you think about how the first round kind of played out and how Derrick Henry fit in?
Yeah, and I remember you saying that before the season, that you were going to be, pro Derrick Henry, and it fired me up, and I loved it because it shows your flexibility and your sort of like maturity as like a fantasy analyst, and I thought it was great, and also you were joining my side, so I love that. But we went hard on the big dog again, had him at number the 5th overall player. In the top 150, he was 107 at Football Guys Championship ADP. And, that may not sound like enough, but 2 slots in the first round. I mean, the margins are really, really slim in the first 2 to 3 rounds. Our top 150 matches up very closely with ADP pretty much every year with very few exceptions. But a 2 slot difference does make a big difference. And, we expected the Titans to be good, and we expected that they had a soft schedule. And that sets up perfectly for a guy like Derrick Henry to eat in positive game script. The Titans went on to go 11-5. Derrick Henry became just the 8th 2,000-yard rusher in NFL history. I was hoping that he would flirt with 30 catches, but he did not. But he did set a career high in targets and catches. He led the NFL in yards from scrimmage and touchdowns. So I think we can chalk this one up as a pretty solid hit that helped people win leagues.
Yep. Okay. As we move to the second round, one that was a miss was the DeAndre Hopkins situation. And DeAndre Hopkins had an ADP of around 16, and they came out with, and and we'll get to this on misses later. I had high hopes for Christian Kirk. I had high hopes for Andy Isabella. I had high hopes for Kenyon Drake. I had high hopes that Cliff Kingsbury would expand the offense beyond being this kind of simplistic, fake sharp, horizontal raid type stuff. It turned into Kyler Murray drops back, scrambles for a while, makes some crazy plays, and is locked on to DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins only ended up scoring, I think, 6 touchdowns. But man, his target volume was obviously, and his connection with Kyler Murray right out of the gate was way more than what we expected. Now, Evan was on the side of players, wide receivers changing teams, have an awful, awful history. And we can mention Steph Diggs here too as a miss. And it turned out that Steph Diggs and DeAndre Hopkins and Justin Jefferson, rookie, all guys in new situations, turned out to be great. I don't know if I'm willing to change my stance on these kind of situations going forward, but I think in light of what Hopkins and Diggs and Justin Jefferson did, it's at least worth considering. So, Evan, how do you see the fallout from Hopkins? And then we can get to Diggs also.
Yeah, and breaking on guys like Hopkins is legitimately embarrassing because I took a strong stance against him, even as I obviously knew he's one of the best receivers and really just one of the best football players in the entire league. And I remember watching that first game against the 49ers and knowing immediately that I blew it. So I didn't waste any time, embracing that L and moving forward. One of my biggest DFS wins of the season late in the year, I think it was $1,500 entry. Millie Maker was a Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins stack later in the year. Mm-hmm. And they just showed incredible chemistry from the jump. Kyler Murray clearly identified DeAndre Hopkins as a guy that he could trust, just throwing the ball up to, and that's how you get the best out of Hopkins for sure. DeAndre Hopkins was not even running particularly complex routes. It's just he's almost unguardable on the hitch route along the sideline. And Kyler Murray identified that right away. I wonder if, of course, there's that history of that first slow year with wide receivers changing teams. But I wonder if that actually worked in favor of guys like DeAndre Hopkins and Steph Diggs, in addition to the fact that they're just remarkable talents, but because there were no OTAs to make sure that Andy Isabella got his touches. There were no mini camps to make sure that, hey, we're going to keep Larry Fitz involved this year. They just went out and balled, And so I wonder if that worked in favor of DeAndre Hopkins and Steph Diggs and the wide receivers that changed teams this year. But I think ultimately it really comes down to talent and fading marquee talent. Like, we had to take strong stances on players, to try to get ahead of the field in a game like this, like fantasy football. But I absolutely bricked on these two guys.
Yeah. See, I don't know. I'm going to look into it more and whether I'm going to change my stance on wide receivers changing teams, because I do think that a lot of times, you don't get these truly elite talents changing teams in the prime of their career a lot. A lot of times the data goes back to guys who maybe at the tail end of their career. And, even guys like Odell, changed teams and wasn't great for Cleveland. I don't know, man. I'm going to look into it more. The one thing that I regret about Steph Diggs, though, and I was out on Steph Diggs even at an ADP in the 50s, or the 60s. I mean, how can we be so high on Josh Allen and not expect him to drag Steph Diggs along with him? And we'll get to Josh Allen later, because Josh Allen was one of our biggest hits. But if we thought Josh Allen was going to have this huge year, and yeah, we thought a lot of it would come from rushing, but how could we not think that Steph Diggs would also come along for a huge year? So I don't mind being like maybe a little bit lower than market on Steph Diggs, but I think in hindsight, knowing how much we liked Josh Allen, well, maybe we should have been higher on Steph Diggs. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And yeah, it may seem strange that we weren't correspondingly high on Steph Diggs when we were super, super high on Josh Allen. My thinking was that the Bills would remain a largely balanced offense with, a pretty good defense that didn't give up a lot of points. Their run-pass ratio would not explode, and certainly not that Josh Allen would finish top 6 in the NFL in pass attempts, and that a healthy John Brown, Cole Beasley, maybe a second-year leap from Dawson Knox a little bit, and Diggs would finish at like 75 catches, maybe 900 yards, 6 to 7 touchdowns, enough to really elevate not just Josh Allen, but the players around him, but not necessarily to be this, 115 catch guy. And instead, the Bills just fully embraced playing pass first spread. Diggs went nuclear, career highs in basically everything. So that was my thinking at the time. Not that he would necessarily tear the cover off, but he wound up doing so, and the offense played right into his hands. It was just like DeAndre Hopkins, where they showed no caution in targeting the heck out of Stephon Diggs, and deservedly so, because he's such a baller.
Yeah, and as we're in the middle of best ball season, we're at the beginning of best ball season. I would encourage people to listen back about the stacking things that Justin Herzig talked about in the last podcast about how to think about stacking. Because obviously, if you were high on Steph Diggs, you would end up with a lot of Josh Allen if you're stacking, and vice versa in best ball. So yeah, okay, those were a couple misses in Hopkins and Diggs. A hit that you were all over, I believe you led the shy away with this one, was Josh Jacobs busting it, and I get it, Josh Jacobs had an ADP of 16.5. He did have 12 touchdowns, but only 33 catches all year and only 1,065 rushing yards in 15 games. And so, yeah, I get that his overall volume looked good because he stayed healthy the whole year. But man, I think he was a bust because we win in fantasy with spikes, and Jacobs only went over 100 yards twice all year. I mean, all year in 15 games, only twice over 100 yards. He had 3 touchdowns against Carolina in week 1 when he was like the lock in DFS, and we talked about he was a lock in DFS. And then he got this brutal schedule we talked about, and he doesn't play in the pass game. And that's exactly how it played out. They got behind in games. They didn't use Josh Jacobs in the pass game. And so it's really hard to find value there. So I think the process on fading Josh Jacobs at this early second round ADP was really, really good. I assume you felt good about the Josh Jacobs fade as well and how it played out.
Yeah, his ADP was actually 10th overall on the Football Guys Championship. We had him as the number 17 overall player. 24 running backs finished with more receiving yards than Josh Jacobs did this past season. You said he was healthy. I mean, he played in 15 games, but man, he was banged up all year. He was banged up as a rookie too. Mm-hmm. And you go back and look at his college career, he was never a bell cow back at Alabama. He actually played behind Damian Harris. So I think it's fair to question whether Josh Jacobs is a true bell cow at the NFL level. He only played 57% of the Raiders' offensive snaps this past year, only missed 1 game, still was well below 60% from a playing time standpoint. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how they treat him going forward. I mean, I think he is a really, really, good talent, but he hasn't been able to he's had all kinds of injuries to all parts of his body, just consistently nagging injuries. And he also hasn't been a standout in the passing game.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's why it is the same archetype almost as Nick Chubb, as Derrick Henry, but Josh Jacobs is just worse on a worse team. And so you get a lot of downside there for where his ADP was. I think the process on that one was really good. Speaking of running backs and talent questions, I mean, big miss for me on James Conner. I look back at drafts that I did, and I took James Conner like every time he was there for me in the 3rd round, like every single time. And I don't know exactly what happened because, I mean, if you told me Ben Roethlisberger, they were going to abandon the run and Ben Roethlisberger was going to throw the ball a ton and he was going to throw it short a ton, I'd be like, okay, like James Conner can survive on that. He'll be the goal line back. He's so far ahead of McFarland. He's so far ahead of Benny Snell. It's not a problem. He's going to catch, 60, 70, 80 balls and it's going to be great. Instead, maybe James Conner, we overrated his talent. And I hate to say that about running backs, but he didn't separate from McFarland and Benny Snell. And to me, that was a huge concern, a huge miss. What do you think happened with James Conner? Because this one really hurt me a lot.
Yeah, and he was looking like a solid pick for most of the first half of the season. Through week 8, he was averaging almost 90 total yards per game. He was on pace for 10 touchdowns. But then injuries, these nagging injuries that have really dogged him throughout his career started to set in. The Steelers' running game just collapsed. I mean, it didn't matter who was in there. They could not run the ball. And it devolved into maybe the most dysfunctional rushing attack and overall offense in the second half of the league because of the season, because, and then, Ben started to fall apart too. And I was like you, this was a guy I felt very comfortable taking at the 2-3 turn in season-long leagues, and he was barely usable in the second half of the season. Now he's, I believe, a free agent, and he's going to be a guy that probably signs for 1 year, $2 million.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, that was bad. Good was, and this one was hard. I went back and I listened to the podcast that we did about our biggest busts last year. We recorded in August, and people were pained and were shocked that I said it, but I thought Chris Godwin was going to be one of the biggest busts of the year, and for the reasons, not because I don't believe in Chris Godwin's talent, which I do, was the going from Jameis Winston to Tom Brady was, for fantasy, I thought was going to be a huge downgrade. Now, Tom Brady played way better than I expected. He was way more aggressive. His downfield ball was way better than I expected. But this is what happens when you're in better game scripts. I mean, Jameis Winston was throwing pick sixes at such a high rate. It was just so good for Chris Godwin. So in 12 games, Chris Godwin only had 64 catches, 840 yards, 7 touchdowns. I know he missed 4 games, but still, the way that Chris Godwin was used and his upside was not nearly the same as it was with Jameis. So just being all in on wide receiver talent and not thinking about how the game scripts will change when quarterbacks change, and we're going to have a lot of quarterbacks change this offseason, I think is something to feel good about with avoiding Chris Godwin. A lot of the problem was at the end of that 2-3 turn. I know you took Aaron Jones a lot, which was really good. I didn't feel too comfortable with Aaron Jones, so I kind of didn't take him as much. There weren't a lot of guys I wanted at the 2-3 turn, and that's how I ended up with a lot of James Conner, unfortunately. But yeah, still, being off Chris Godwin, I think, was good. What did you think about how it played out for him?
Yeah, I think you summed it up really nicely, and you deserve more credit for this hit than I do, because I had him right in line with ADP, and that's how I wanted it, because he was always a good floor play. But as you continually pointed out before the season, the upside for him to do what he did in 2019 just was never going to be there. Going from Jameis Winston to Tom Brady. I mean, it's easy to forget that Jameis led the NFL in passing yards in 2019, had over 5,000 passing yards. And Brady had a great year in 2020, but he still threw for almost 500 fewer yards. The Bucs were more balanced. They had a great defense. The ball got spread around a lot more in the passing game. So Godwin wound up being basically like a wide receiver 2/3 in 2020. And he was a top 3 guy in 2019. And I don't know, he's another free agent.
Yeah. And, Tom Brady's going to throw to tight ends, and he's going to throw to running backs at a way higher rate than Jameis would. Okay. This one, put this one on the Evan Silva wall of fame. Calvin Ridley, who was going in maybe the 6th round around this time last year, then up to the 5th round. Then, he started going the 4th round. There's a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon, but you could still get him even in September. You can get Calvin Ridley. You could have gotten him in the 4th round. And I was skeptical. I thought it was okay in the 4th round. I was skeptical of Calvin Ridley in the 3rd round. I thought he had chances to be the man before and hadn't really exploded in those chances. But this year, my God, I know Julio was banged up, but Calvin, 90 catches, 1,374 yards, 9 touchdowns in 15 games. 8 times Calvin Ridley went over 100 yards. Just an absolute monster season from Calvin Ridley. So go ahead, Evan. We've talked about some misses here. Take the Calvin Ridley victory lap.
Yeah, so in PPR points per game, Calvin Ridley finished as the overall wide receiver 4. His overall ADP was 38th overall at Football Guys Championship. We had him 28th overall. So good chance if you were using our rankings, you were getting Calvin Ridley. My thinking was that the Falcons were going to throw a ton. Matt Ryan did go on to lead the NFL in pass attempts. They play so many games indoors or in favorable conditions. I thought that Calvin Ridley was an ascending player, and there was a chance that Julio might fall off, and there would just be an avalanche of targets falling onto Calvin Ridley. I don't think Julio totally fell off from a skill or performance standpoint, but he did wind up battling a season-long hamstring injury. It cost him 7 games, parts of several others. So, yeah, Ridley was an absolute monster. He was hyper consistent. He was a true wide receiver 1 in 2020.
Yeah, the worst part about Julio is that he plays through these injuries. So you can't even sit him because he plays, and then he plays at less than 100% and he takes air balls. And yeah, it was really bad on Julio. And Calvin Ridley, though, absolute smash. Okay, I grouped all these early mid-round running backs together so that we could kind of talk about them as the same archetype. And these were all hits. We were off Ty Gurley. We were off Le'Veon Bell. We were off Leonard Fournette, famously. We were off David Johnson. We were off Raheem Mostert. All these guys we just had no interest in. We were taking wide receivers. We were taking tight ends. We were even taking quarterbacks in the range where these guys were going. Just no interest in them. And for a very clear reason. These guys are just such massive traps. Corain has written so much about it. You could throw in Melvin Gordon and Mark Ingram in there too. What these guys all have in common is they're so dependent on touchdowns. They're so dependent on volume. They're not great players. They don't have great pass game roles. Literally the only reason that people draft them is because they're a starting running back and we're betting on their offense. Again, you can go back to a lot of stuff Corain wrote about hit rates by round, but these round 3 through 7, 3 through 6 running backs are often so brutal. So yeah, I felt really good about being off of these guys. We were pretty shocked that people even had interest in Fournette and David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell and guys like that. But people do, and people will again this year. Will have interest in these kind of mid-round guys. So yeah, I know that I described Derrick Henry in kind of the same archetype, but as a complete outlier, these guys clearly weren't. What do you think about this range of running backs?
Well, I think that their ADPs that were higher than deserved were based primarily on the excitement for the robust RB strategy. Mm-hmm. And people were just trying to jam in robust RB into their drafts. And I think that the lesson to take away from this is don't get hung up on one strategy. Have flexibility. Every draft is different. And I mean, being anti-robust RB is not me being, necessarily, zero wide receiver or zero RB. Mm-hmm. And, you can invoke any of those strategies in a specific draft. But I think you have to have flexibility, and really you should let what happens in the first 2 rounds determine the way that the rest of your draft is going to go. Do not try to force one strategy into all your drafts. I mean, that's a way, like robust RB was an epic disaster in 2020.
Oh yeah. I mean, my favorite construction last year, if I could do it, was running back to start, and then like 7 straight wide receivers. Like that was what I tried to do a lot. It doesn't always work out like that, but in those middle rounds, the mean outcome for wide receiver is just so much better than running back. And that's going back historically. It's not even in today's NFL. And I think it's getting wider, that gap between wide receivers and running backs in today's NFL. But you can go back a ways and it's still that way. And so, yeah, I mean, wide receivers are just going to have so much bigger ceilings. And yeah, specifically on Mostert, I wanted to mention, when you're in a timeshare, which we can always expect Mostert and San Francisco to use, which we could have before the season. And then you also don't really have a pass catching role on a fragile team. Like I know a lot of people thought San Francisco would be really good, but they were still pretty fragile. I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster. And I think that's what happened with Mostert too. Okay. Now, also in that mid-rounds though, we need to mention a miss because David Montgomery, I mean, I took absolutely zero David Montgomery. And this was a tough run out, and I don't want to make excuses or whatever, but if Tariq Cohen doesn't go down in, what was that, like week 2 or something like that? If Tariq Cohen doesn't go down, I mean, I don't think David Montgomery ever gets a 3-down role, but they had no plan behind Tariq Cohen. So all of a sudden, David Montgomery is a 3-down plus goal line back. And still, even with that role, I mean, he sucked for a lot of the first half of the year. But then he gets Green Bay, Detroit, Houston, Minnesota, Jacksonville, Green Bay to end the year. And I thought Mitchell Trubisky provided a little bit of a spark. Like he actually gave the offense a little bit of a juice, which I can't believe I'm saying, but I thought he did. And so it kind of all worked out perfectly for David Montgomery, and he ended up actually being like a league winner. Like David Montgomery was an absolute monster down the stretch if you could have your team in a place for the first half where you could make that run. So yeah, definitely a miss there on the mid-round running backs. What did you think about how the David Montgomery run out went?
Yeah, and we definitely had him as a before the season fade. He also had that groin injury leading into the season. Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned, a lot of the thinking was based on how much usage that Tariq Cohen was going to suck up. So when Tariq Cohen tore his ACL in week 3, I mean, I started putting in the matchups column, like, think about trading for David Montgomery. Mm-hmm. And hopefully some ETR subscribers were able to do that because David Montgomery obviously went on to parlay like a substantially expanded role without Tariq Cohen, plus a super soft schedule that you mentioned, and being a league winner down the stretch. And I also do believe, it's not just the loss of Tariq Cohen. It's not just the easy schedule. I do believe that Montgomery showed signs of becoming a better player on the field because for most of his rookie season and much of the first half of 2020, I thought he looked like a plotter out there. And, even going back to Iowa State, he was good at a lot of different things, but he was never a master of one trade. And, he was never a big play guy, right. Never a home run threat at Iowa State. I've never seen a running back get caught from behind more often, in the freaking Big 12 than was David Montgomery. But he was a playmaker in the second half of 2020. It certainly was juiced by the schedule, but I do think he ran with a lot more confidence, and he's a guy that he's going to have job security going into 2021.
Yeah, I mean, he made a lot of big plays down the stretch. I mean, he had, what did he have, like a 90-yard run or something that we just didn't think he was capable of. So, yeah, for sure, miss on Dave Montgomery. Okay, last one we're going to do on this early round hits and misses edition is Mark Andrews. And this one is more on me, man, because I really like the idea of Andrews in the late 4th, 5th round. I remember we did a live stream draft where I made us take Mark Andrews in like the 4th or 5th round, and Evan hated it. And so, and I don't like taking tight ends there. I think I said something completely idiotic like, I'd rather have Mark Andrews in the 5th than Travis Kelce in the 1st or something like that. But yeah, I like the idea of Andrews in the 4th or 5th, assuming that the Ridley, McLaurin, Lockett, Metcalf types were already gone. I thought the foot issue was behind Andrews. I thought Baltimore would have to throw a ton more. I thought that Andrews was clearly their top target, especially in the red zone. It just didn't work out like that. Lamar did not progress as a passer at all. The scheme didn't skew more pass heavy really at all, even though they were losing more. And so it just was really bad for Mark Andrews. In hindsight, I think it was probably a mistake, especially because I like that late tier of Fant and Hawkinson and Goddard and all those guys a lot. And so 4th or 5th rounder on Mark Andrews is probably bad in hindsight. What do you think?
And Mark Andrews, and I love him as a player. I mean, he's like a route, yards per route run aficionado, like a monster in terms of yards per route run, at least his first 2 seasons. But he always did carry a decent amount of risk with him into 2020 because so much of his production the year before was just built on touchdowns. He scored 10 touchdowns on 64 catches in 2019. We knew that Lamar Jackson wasn't going to lead the league in touchdown passes again. And Lamar wound up throwing 10 fewer touchdowns than he did in his MVP year. So Andrews only scored 7. He actually caught fewer passes in 2020 than he did in 2019. He went up as the tight end 6. So, I mean, the tight end position is really tough, man. Yeah. I mean, Robert Tonyan was the tight end 4, and, Gronk was, the top 10 tight end, and had a bunch of terrible games. But obviously a lot of people thought that Mark Andrews could contend for the overall tight end 1. He didn't even come close. Travis Kelce outscored him by 10 points per game. Darren Waller outscored him by over 4 points per game. The tight end position is really difficult. I'm going to be looking to buy Mark Andrews though in 2021.
Yeah. And obviously ADPs are still taking shape, and we'll have ADP data, and we'll have ADP data baked into a bit of our rankings on Underdog and FFPC as well, but certainly something to track. I mean, when it's this early, the market is still forming their opinions, and so certainly an interesting time to be drafting if you are prepared like we are. Okay, we'll be back on the next episode. We'll talk about later round hits and misses, guys like Keenan Allen, Will Fuller, Deontay Johnson, Aaron Rodgers, guys like that we'll talk about on the next episode. Check us out for that. We will be back every week with 2 of these, free from now until September. Be sure you're subscribed. Again, it is, of course, free. So, for producer Luke, for Evan, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.